Imagine this. It's March 1943. Lieutenant James Howard is flying his B-17 bomber 23,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France. He and his crew have just spent 8 grueling hours in freezing air dodging German fighters, all to hit a ball-bearing factory near Paris. The bombardier calls out, "Bombs away." He's confident. But when Howard checks through his binoculars, he sees all 12 of their 500-pound bombs explode in a wheat field, about half a mile off target. And it wasn't just his crew. Out of 228 bombers on that mission, only 19 hit anything even close to what they were aiming for. That's an 8% success rate. And believe it or not, that was considered a good day. At the time, U.S. generals in Washington were promising Congress that precision bombing during daylight would win the war. They had charts, models, and a lot of confidence. But over in Europe, bomber crews were learning a harsh reality. Bombing from 4 miles up at 180 miles an hour, while under attack and surrounded by anti-aircraft fire, made accurate hits nearly impossible. The Army Air Forces had calculated they needed half the bombs to land within 1,000 feet of the target to do real damage. But by summer 1943, the average missed distance was more like 3,200 feet. Some missions were even worse. Take the first raid on Schweinfurt in August 1943. U.S. bombers dropped 724 tons of bombs on factories that made 40% of Germany's ball bearings. But after the mission, recon photos showed less than 200 tons actually hit inside the factory area. The rest hit homes, open fields, and even a centuries-old church 3 miles away. That day, 60 bombers were shot down. About 600 airmen were killed or taken prisoner. And those same factories were back in full operation within 6 weeks. Air crews started calling the tactic the aluminum cloud method. You'd fly in a tight group, follow the lead bomber, and drop your bombs when they did, hoping that sheer quantity would make up for the lack of accuracy. But most German industrial sites weren't that large. A synthetic oil plant might be 40 acres, but if your bombs were spreading across 300 acres due to poor aim, you were basically just bombing and hoping. The cost and lives was staggering. Every mission meant flying into walls of exploding shells. Those black bursts, 80 millimeters flak, could tear through a bomber like it was made of paper. In 1943, bomber crews had only about a 1 in 4 chance of surviving the required 25 missions. And for what? Many watched their bombs vanish into clouds, or worse, saw them destroy neighborhoods while the real target stayed intact. Morale started to fall apart. So why were American bombers flying these dangerous daylight missions while the British switched to bombing at night? The answer: the Norden bombsight. The Norden was a mechanical targeting device, kind of like an early analog computer, designed to make bombing more accurate. It weighed about 50 pounds and cost around $8,000 back then, more than a house. The U.S. military spent $1.5 billion developing and building it, making it one of the most expensive weapons programs of the war. For comparison, the entire Manhattan Project cost $2 billion. Invented in the 1920s by Carl Norden, a Swiss engineer in New York, the bombsight let bombardiers track targets through a scope while the system calculated wind, speed, altitude, and angle. It was even wired into the plane's autopilot, so the bombardier could steer the aircraft slightly during the bombing run for better accuracy. In test runs, bombs landed within 100 feet of the target from 20,000 feet up. There were even claims it could hit a pickle barrel from 4 miles in the sky. The military treated the Norden like it was top secret. Bombardiers had to take a separate oath not to talk about it. Before missions, an armed guard would bring the device to the plane in a locked case. If the bomber was going down, the bombardier was ordered to destroy the Norden with a thermite grenade before bailing out. Some died trying to follow those orders, staying in burning planes too long while trying to melt the device. The U.S. believed if the enemy got their hands on one, it would be game over. But here's the twist. The Germans already had the Norden plans. A spy named Hermann Lang stole them back in 1938. German engineers took a look, weren't impressed, and stuck with their own bomb targeting system. Why? Because they had already figured out what the Americans were just starting to realize. The Norden didn't work in real combat. It only performed well under perfect conditions. Clear skies, no flak, no fighters, and plenty of time to line up the shot. None of that existed over Europe. The first major wake-up call came from the targets themselves. German factories weren't sitting out in open fields waiting to be hit. They were protected. By late 1943, most large industrial sites had smoke systems that could cover the entire area in just 5 minutes. And every major site was required to have enough smoke to hide itself for at least 30 minutes. That meant American crews could see their targets clearly during the approach. But just as they were ready to drop bombs, poof, it all disappeared in a thick fog of smoke. At that point, the Norden bombsight was basically useless. It couldn't guess where to aim. And then there was the biggest problem. Combat. For the Norden to work properly, bombers needed to fly straight and level for about 3 minutes. But flying in a straight line over enemy territory made them sitting ducks. German anti-aircraft crews knew exactly where to aim. Pilots realized that flying evasively gave them a better chance of surviving, but the moment they started turning or changing altitude, the Norden couldn't keep up. So, crews were stuck with a deadly choice: stay steady and risk being shot down, or try to dodge and miss the target completely. By 1943, Germany had built the most advanced air defense network in history, and it was tearing the U.S. 8th Air Force apart. The core of their defense was the 88mm flak gun, known officially as the Flak 18, 36, or 37, depending on the version. These guns weren't just for tanks. They were built to take down bombers. Germany produced around 21,000 of them during the war. About half were stationed around key targets across occupied Europe. What made them so deadly? Each one could fire a 20-pound explosive shell up to 32,000 feet at a rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Crews manually set each shell's time fuse based on the bomber's altitude, so it would explode at just the right height, spraying deadly shrapnel in every direction at supersonic speeds. A single piece of that shrapnel, no bigger than a thumb, could rip through the aircraft, cut wires, damage engines, or kill crew members instantly. And these guns didn't fire solo. They operated in groups. A big target area like the Ruhr Valley might be covered by 40 to 60 flak guns, all working together. German radar systems, like the Würzburg, could track incoming bomber formations from 40 miles away and send real-time data to the gun crews. Each flak battery had mechanical calculators to figure out altitude, speed, and heading, and give exact firing instructions. The Germans could start shooting before U.S. bombers even reached the target. During a large raid, bomber crews would fly into what they call flak fields, huge patches of sky filled with exploding shells. It was chaos. Flying through at 18,000 feet meant you were right in the kill zone. Crews described the scene as pitch black with explosions so thick you couldn't see the sky. The sound was overwhelming, like being trapped inside a metal drum while someone pounded it from all sides. Navigator John Morris, part of the 301st Bomb Group, wrote about one mission to Bremen. After landing, he counted 127 holes in their plane. He added, "Don't know how we made it. Jenkins bled out in the waist before we crossed the channel." Jenkins was just 19. To try and reduce losses, U.S. commanders decided to fly higher. By mid-1943, bombers were regularly flying at 25,000 to 27,000 feet, sometimes even higher. The idea was to get above most of the flak's effective range and avoid some of the enemy fighters, which struggled at extreme altitudes. But flying that high brought new problems. At 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was so thin that engines didn't perform well, even with turbochargers. Crews needed heated suits and constant oxygen just to stay alive. And accuracy? It got even worse. Remember how the Norden was supposed to hit tiny targets from high up? Every factor that messed with bombing at 18,000 feet got worse at 25,000. Wind at those altitudes wasn't mild. It could hit 80, 100, even 120 miles per hour. Jet streams weren't fully understood back then. Crews just knew sometimes their bombs would drift miles off course. Visibility was unreliable. From above, clouds looked harmless, but once you flew into them, the target vanished. Temperature shifts in the atmosphere bent light, making it hard to aim correctly. No one planned the offset bombing tactic. It happened by accident. During the second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943, another attack on ball-bearing plants. Things were already going badly. Of the 291 bombers sent, 60 were shot down, and 17 were so damaged they never flew again. That's a 26% loss in a single mission. But something strange stood out in the mission reports. One group, the 305th Bomb Group, ended up bombing from a wrong angle instead of the planned north-to-south approach. They came in from a northeast at about a 40-degree angle. Their navigator, Captain Robert Williams, had misjudged the wind correction. By the time the pilots realized the mistake, it was too late to fix it. Turning a formation of 18 bombers under enemy fire just wasn't possible. So Williams made a snap decision. Captain Robert Williams gave his bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, a simple but game-changing order. Instead of aiming directly at the factory, Murphy was told to use the crosswind knobs on the Norden bombsight to aim off to the right, away from the actual target. The idea was to aim at a spot next to the factory and let the wind carry the bombs back onto it. Every bomber had a strike camera, and when the photos came back, the results were clear. Most groups that day hit their usual 8 to 12% of the target, but the 305th Bomb Group's bombs went right through the heart of the factory. 42% of their payload hit the target area. At first, people thought it was just luck, but Williams stood by it and backed it up with math. Here's what he figured out. The Norden bombsight was designed with one big assumption. It expected you to fly directly at your target with either a headwind or a tailwind. It could adjust for those. But that's not what was happening at 25,000 feet over Europe. Up there, the wind almost always came from the side. That meant the plane wasn't just moving forward. It was also being pushed sideways. To stay on course, pilots had to point the nose slightly into the wind. That angle is called crabbing. It's like walking straight while leaning into the wind. But when you drop bombs while crabbing, they don't just fall straight. They keep moving sideways with the plane. The Norden was great at handling forward motion, but it didn't deal well with sideways drift unless you were flying straight at the target. With strong crosswinds, that meant bombs could land hundreds of feet off. Williams' accidental discovery changed the game. Instead of fighting the wind, he used it. The trick was to fly at an angle to the target, say 40 or 50 degrees, and aim at a reference point that was upwind of the actual target. That could be anything. A road crossing, a river bend, or a distinct building. The bombardier would line up that reference point in the sight, release the bombs, and the wind would carry them sideways, right onto the real target. The idea was all about geometry. At a steep angle with the right wind, the bombs would follow a predictable path and land with much tighter spread. Instead of a long, scattered pattern along the flight path, the bombs tracked sideways in a narrow line. It felt backwards, aiming away from the target. But the physics worked. The math wasn't complicated, but it did force crews to completely rethink how they bombed. The old mindset said, aim straight at the target, let the Norden do the rest. The new method said, forget the target for a second, focus on the wind. Bombardiers had all learned about wind triangles in training, but most treated them like classroom theory. Now, those triangles meant the difference between hitting a factory and hitting a hospital a few blocks away. Here's how the math played out. Let's say you're flying at 25,000 feet, going 180 miles per hour. There's a crosswind blowing from west to east at 90 miles per hour. Once you release your bombs, they take about 60 seconds to hit the ground. In that time, your forward momentum carries them about 3 miles ahead, but the crosswind also pushes them 1.5 miles sideways. If you aim directly at the target, your bombs will miss by more than 1 mile, landing somewhere you never intended. But if you fly at an angle from the west, with the wind on your left, and aim at something 1.5 miles west of the factory, the wind will drift the bombs right where they need to go. That's where wind speed accuracy became crucial. Navigators started using a method called double drift on the approach. They'd take 2 wind drift readings at different points and compare them to figure out how strong the crosswind really was. A good navigator could get within 5 miles per hour of the true wind speed, and that was enough to make offset bombing accurate. The results were impressive. In tests during late 1943, bombing error, the average miss distance dropped from 3,200 feet down to about 1,100 feet when using a 45-degree offset. That was nearly the 1,000-foot goal the Air Force had set from beginning. On clear days, top-notch navigator bombardier teams could get it down to 800 feet. Sure, that's nowhere near today's GPS-guided weapons, which can hit within 15 feet. But back in 1943, it was a breakthrough. It meant that for the first time, U.S. bombers could actually hit what they were aiming at. Instead of dropping bombs all over the countryside, they were striking inside the factory walls. But offset bombing only worked with tight coordination between three people: the navigator, the bombardier, and the pilot. The navigator had to get the wind data exactly right and pick the correct offset point. The bombardier had to trust that math and aim at a spot that, deep down, felt wrong. And the pilot? He had to fly a perfect course and hold altitude while anti-aircraft shells were bursting all around, every instinct telling him to swerve or dive. One slip from any of them, and accuracy was out the window. Training became the biggest hurdle. Bombardiers who'd spent months learning to aim directly at a target had to break that habit. It was like teaching someone to shoot a basketball by aiming at the backboard, not the hoop. Everything in their brain pushed back. The Army Air Forces opened special training centers in Florida and Arizona, where bomber crews practiced offset runs over mock-ups of German factories. They flew these drills over and over until the new method started to feel natural. Even experienced crews who had already seen combat were pulled back to England for retraining. That's how serious leadership was about making this work. By January 1944, the 8th Air Force had a rare kind of problem. They'd found a tactic that actually worked, and now they had to teach it to 12,000 men spread out over 40 airfields, all while still fighting a war. General James Doolittle, who had just taken over command of the 8th, saw the offset bombing results and made it priority number one. He told Brigadier General Fred Anderson to retrain every navigator and bombardier in 6 weeks. Anderson's reaction reportedly wasn't printable, but he got it done. They started with the lead crews, the guys fly in front who everyone else followed. If anyone needed to master the technique, it was them. Training schools were set up on every bomber base using a mix of classroom lessons and real flight practice over England's coastal bombing ranges. The classroom part drilled in the math, wind triangles, drift corrections, and how to plot the offset. Crews practiced it until it became second nature. Then came the tough part, flying in British winter. Cloud cover was constant. Winds were all over the place. Daylight was limited, but in a strange way that helped. If crews could make it work under English skies, they'd be fine over Germany. They'd take off at dawn, fly to bombing ranges off the coast, and run practice drops on floating targets or decommissioned ships. Crews had to complete at least 3 successful offset runs before getting combat approval. Some needed up to 10 to get the feel. What made it all work was that combat veterans were the instructors. This wasn't a classroom lecture from some officer with a pointer. It was Lieutenant Charles Murphy, the guy who discovered offset bombing over Schweinfurt, standing in a cold Quonset hut, showing other crews how he did it. Captain Williams taught navigation, walking crews through his wind calculations using real mission data. When someone struggled with the idea of aiming away from the target, instructors pulled out strike camera footage. They'd show side-by-side results. Standard bombing with 9% accuracy, then offset bombing hitting 38%. The proof was hard to argue with. Meanwhile, official doctrine caught up. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force rewrote its bombing manuals. Field Order 259, issued on February 20th, gave the green light to use offset bombing on any mission with crosswinds over 40 miles per hour. Every group commander received briefings that laid out the best offset angles for key targets across Germany. For example, Schweinfurt worked best with northeast approaches at 45 degrees. The Ruhr Valley factories? Westward angles of 50 degrees were ideal. It wasn't a smooth transition. Some older pilots, especially those who had survived the brutal missions of 1943, didn't want to change what had kept them alive. There's even a well-known case from March 1944, where a pilot from a 91st Bomb Group flat out refused to use an offset approach over Brunswick. He stuck to the old straight-in attack. His bombardier missed the target by half a mile. That pilot was quietly pulled from combat duty. Doolittle wasn't messing around. His stance was clear: adapt or step aside. By April 1944, offset bombing had become standard. Mission briefings now included detailed wind forecasts at bombing altitude. Navigators received pre-planned offset headings based on those wind reports. If conditions changed mid-flight, they had charts on hand to adjust their approach in real time. The whole process was becoming streamlined. That meant even average crews, those who used to struggle, could now deliver far better results. The numbers backed it up. By March 1944, bombing accuracy had improved dramatically. The average missed distance dropped to around 1,250 feet, a 60% improvement compared to December. Even more impressive, the percentage of bombs landing inside target areas jumped from 11% to 27%. Sure, that still meant most bombs missed, but it was a massive step forward. Targets that used to require 4 or 5 missions to seriously damage could now be taken out in 2. The real test came on D-Day. On June 6, 1944, everything hinged on the bombers. Their job was to take out German defenses along the French coast before Allied troops hit the beaches. If offset bombing failed, the invasion could be a disaster. These weren't just gun nests. They were fortified bunkers made of reinforced concrete with walls 8 feet thick. Inside were artillery pieces powerful enough to tear apart landing craft from 3 miles out. Allied intelligence had identified 49 of these heavy gun positions along a 50-mile stretch of coastline. Every single one needed to be taken out before troops hit the beaches, or thousands would die before even making it to shore. The 8th Air Force was assigned to bomb the defenses at Utah and Omaha beaches. They had a narrow window, just 40 minutes, from 5:50 to 6:30 a.m., to drop over 2,900 tons of bombs on an area smaller than 2 square miles. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Bombing had to be done at dawn, with heavy clouds expected between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. According to standard doctrine, bombing through clouds was a no-go, but offset bombing and radar were about to change that. Here's how they planned it. Special lead aircraft called Pathfinders were equipped with H-2X radar. This system could see the coastline through clouds by detecting where land met water. Navigators would match the radar images to known coastal features, river mouths, peninsulas, curves in the shoreline, and use those as reference points, just like visual offset bombing. The difference was they were now using radar instead of their eyes. From there, the math was the same. Bombardiers would track the offset point on radar, calculate how far the bombs would drift in the wind, and release when the math said go. D-Day morning didn't go smoothly. The cloud cover was much worse than predicted. Some areas had solid overcast from 2,000 to 10,000 feet. Bombers had to drop to 12,000 feet to get under the worst of it, putting them within range of any surviving German anti-aircraft guns. The wind wasn't helping either. Strong crosswinds, 25 to 40 miles per hour, blew in from the northwest, pushing bombers toward the beaches. But this time, the wind became part of the strategy. At Omaha Beach, things looked bad at first. Many bombs landed well inland, tearing up roads and field behind the bunkers. Reports said only 31% of German defenses at Omaha were hit directly, but those numbers miss what happened at Utah. At Utah Beach, the crews used a 45-degree offset, approaching from the northeast. The crosswind pushed their bombs straight toward the shoreline. The result? Bombs landed in tight, effective lines, smashing bunkers, collapsing gun positions, and clearing the way. Of the 28 major German fortifications guarding Utah Beach, 25 were taken out before Allied soldiers even stepped foot on the sand. The difference between Omaha and Utah came down to execution. At Omaha, crews delayed their bomb drops by a few seconds. They were afraid of accidentally hitting their own troops. That tiny delay pushed bomb impacts 200 to 300 yards too far inland. The intention was good. The result was deadly. At Utah, crews followed the math exactly. No delays, no guesses. They trusted the offset calculations. And it worked. When the 4th Infantry Division landed at 6:30 a.m., they met almost no resistance. German defenses had already been destroyed. Casualties were minimal. A classified report from July 1944 summed up clearly: straight-in bombing at Omaha, even with safety changes, had 31% effectiveness. Offset bombing at Utah, 89% effective. That's not a small improvement. That's the difference between a tactic that sort of works and one that actually wins battles. The report concluded that offset bombing cut the number of missions needed to take out fortified targets by 2/3. By the summer of 1944, offset bombing had become standard across the Allied air campaign. It was used in strikes on rail yards before the invasion, in attacks on V-1 launch sites, and in missions targeting Germany's oil industry. Everyone was using it. The method even crossed branches. The 9th Air Force adopted it for tactical support missions. The Royal Air Force, which had once mocked American ideas about precision bombing, started testing offset techniques in their own daylight raids. What started as a desperate workaround in Schweinfurt back in 1943 had become a permanent change in how bombing was done. After the war, analysts dug into the numbers. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found something remarkable between January and December 1944. As offset bombing became widespread, the total tonnage dropped on Germany rose by 340%, and accuracy improved by 190%. In short, they were dropping more bombs and hitting more targets than ever before. That combination, precision through offset bombing, did what early war bombing never could. It broke German industry. After the war, what started as a battlefield fix became part of military doctrine. During the Cold War, the Air Force turned offset bombing into a core science. Once nuclear weapons entered the picture, accuracy wasn't just important, it was critical. Missing by a mile with a regular bomb wastes time and money. Missing by a mile with a nuclear weapon? That could mean hitting the wrong city. By the 1950s, every pilot in Strategic Air Command was trained in offset bombing from day one. They had to know how to calculate angles and drift as instinctively as they knew how to fly. The thinking was simple. If you ever had to drop a nuclear weapon over enemy territory, there'd be no room for error, and flying straight at the target wasn't an option. As tech advanced, so did the tools. When the B-52 Stratofortress joined the fleet in 1955, it came with an onboard radar bombing system that could do most of the math automatically. The N/ASQ 38 could identify radar-based reference points, measure crosswinds, compute offset angles, and guide the bomber to the release point. No manual calculations needed. The bombardier's job became more about monitoring systems than crunching numbers. But the core idea? Still the same one Captain Williams stumbled on in 1943. Use the wind to help, not hinder. Vietnam proved the method still worked, even in entirely different conditions. Monsoon winds over North Vietnam were wild, sometimes worse than anything in Europe. B-52's flying missions against the Ho Chi Minh Trail used offset bombing routinely, calculating angles based on live wind data gathered by weather planes. They were bombing from 30,000 feet through winds over 150 miles per hour and still getting solid results. Recon showed average missed distances under 1,500 feet, even under tough conditions. Then came precision-guided weapons, and it seemed like offset bombing was obsolete. Why bother with wind angles and manual offsets when laser-guided bombs could steer themselves to the target? In 1991, the Gulf War showed off weapons that could hit ventilation shafts. Analysts claimed the era of manually calculated bombing was over. Computers and GPS would handle everything from now on. But that turned out to be overly optimistic. Modern air defenses don't just fire missiles, they jam GPS, scramble targeting systems, and create electronic chaos. When that happens, all those smart bombs become dumb again. And you're right back where bomber crews were in 1943. How do you hit a target when your fancy systems stop working? That's why today's Air Force is bringing offset bombing back. Modern doctrine for GPS-denied missions teaches crews to find radar-visible landmarks, calculate drift manually, and use geometry to deliver weapons, just like in World War II. The B-2 Spirit, one of the most advanced aircraft on the planet, includes offset bombing as a built-in option, not as a backup, but as a primary tactic for stealth missions. Why? Because if you're flying into heavily defended airspace, turning on active sensors gives away your position. With passive offset bombing, you can hit the target without sending a signal. Crews use synthetic aperture radar to spot reference points, plug in the offset angle, account for wind, drop the bomb, and vanish. The enemy only knows what happened when the explosions start. Even drones use offset methods. Operators, flying reapers, and predators sometimes deal with high-altitude winds that would throw off a straight shot. So they aim at an offset point and let the wind guide the missile into position. The final guidance is handled by the weapon itself, but the setup, the geometry, is old school. It's all come full circle. An idea born out of desperation in 1943 has become a key part of modern warfare. Today's military is preparing for battles where GPS might be jammed or completely unavailable. So air crews are once again being trained to do it the hard way. Flight schools are teaching wind triangle math. Bombing ranges are running offset drills. Somewhere in the Pentagon, someone read the after-action reports from D-Day and realized, when new tech fails, old ideas still work. Robert Williams and Charles Murphy probably never imagined that their navigation error over Schweinfurt would shape the future of air warfare. But that's how real breakthroughs happen. You solve a problem so effectively, the solution becomes permanent. Dropping bombs at an angle and using the wind as a weapon wasn't just a clever trick. It was a shift in how the military thinks about space, motion, and precision. Every guided strike today, whether calculated by computer or done by hand, owes something to that October morning in 1943, when a crew aimed at the wrong spot and hit exactly the right one. In the vast history of warfare, most game-changing ideas come from labs, strategy rooms, or elite commanders. But every so often, a breakthrough is born from a mistake. Unexpected, unplanned, and so effective it rewrites the rulebook. Offset bombing was that kind of breakthrough. What started as a navigation error over Schweinfurt in 1943 turned into a tactical revolution that reshaped the U.S. bombing campaign in World War II. It made the difference between bombs scattering harmlessly across fields and roads and actually hitting targets that mattered. It gave meaning to daylight raids that, until then, had cost lives without delivering results. It took something chaotic and deadly and made it calculated, precise, and strategic. And perhaps most impressively, it did so by using the enemy's greatest advantage, the wind, and turning it into a weapon of our own. But offset bombing wasn't just a fix for World War II. It didn't fade when the war ended. It became part of how air forces think, plan, and strike. During the Cold War, as the threat of nuclear conflict loomed large, accuracy stopped being tactical and became existential. One bomb, one city. Missed the target, and you hit something or someone you didn't intend to. There was no margin for error. That's why, by the 1950s, offset bombing wasn't just a technique. It was core doctrine. Every strategic bomber pilot knew how to calculate drift, angle, and approach, not just because it worked, but because their mission might depend on it. From a massive B-52s of Strategic Air Command to the stealth B-2s of today, offset bombing evolved alongside technology. When radar and computers took over, they didn't replace the concept, they refined it. Systems could now compute wind drift in real time, scan for reference points, and automate attack runs. But at the heart of all that tech, still the same basic principle. Don't fight the wind, use it. That insight kept proving useful war after war. In Vietnam, despite harsh weather, extreme altitudes, and powerful monsoon winds, U.S. bombers used offset approaches to great effect. Against the odds, and against some of the worst conditions ever faced in air combat, B-52 crews achieved surgical results over supply lines like the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And yet, just a few decades later, we almost forgot the lesson. When precision-guided weapons emerged, laser-guided bombs, GPS-controlled missiles, satellite-assisted strikes, the military world believed a new era had arrived. And in many ways it had. Bombs could hit within feet, sometimes inches of their target. Air campaigns became cleaner, faster, more exact. Offset bombing seemed outdated. Why calculate drift manually when computers could do it for you? Why aim beside a target when you could aim directly at it and let the weapon adjust mid-flight? But technology, like all things in war, has its limits. Today, we live in a world where peer adversaries don't just build better weapons. They build smarter defenses. They jam GPS signals. They spoof radar returns. They create digital environments where even the most advanced systems can't be trusted. In that world, precision isn't just about smart weapons. It's about smart thinking. And so, in a twist of irony, we've come full circle. The U.S. Air Force and many of its allies are once again training crews in manual offset bombing, not as a backup, but as a frontline solution in high-risk, high-tech battlefields. Pilots are learning wind triangles. Bombing ranges are practicing radar-based offset runs. Mission planning software includes offset geometry by default. Even drones are being programmed to aim based on wind drift, just like their World War II predecessors. This isn't nostalgia. It's strategy. Offset bombing is no longer a workaround. It's a philosophy, one that embraces uncertainty, adapts to the environment, and finds precision not through perfection, but through understanding the battlefield as it truly is. That's the real legacy of offset bombing. Not just better accuracy, but a better mindset. It teaches us that innovation doesn't always come from new tools. Sometimes it comes from seeing old problems in a new way. It shows that flexibility is more valuable than rigid doctrine. That one small decision, a field correction by a young navigator under fire, can ripple across history, reshaping not just missions, but entire wars. And it reminds us that mistakes, when met with open minds and honest analysis, can become breakthroughs. Robert Williams and Charles Murphy probably never imagined that their quick adjustment on a chaotic bombing run would echo into the future. They weren't trying to change the war. They were just trying to hit the target. But that one shift, aiming beside the factory instead of at it, cracked the code on how to bomb from high altitude in combat. It taught future generations how to outthink their environment. It turned physics into a weapon. And in doing so, it saved lives, won battles, and helped bring down one of the most heavily fortified military machines the world has ever seen. Their story isn't just a footnote in military history. It's a lesson in leadership, problem-solving, and persistence. Because the truth is, the world doesn't always give you perfect conditions. The weather will change. The enemy will adapt. The tech will fail. But when that happens, when you find yourself flying blind under fire and running out of time, you don't need perfection. You need perspective. You need the skill to adapt, the training to trust the math, and the courage to act when every instinct is screaming otherwise. That's what offset bombing represents. Not just a technique, but a mindset, one that turns uncertainty into opportunity, one that proves ingenuity under pressure can still change the world, even 80 years later. And so, whether the stealth bomber flying silently through hostile skies, a drone navigating crosswinds over enemy terrain, or a human operator recalculating a mission on the fly with GPS down and jammers online, offset bombing lives on. It began with a mistake. It continues as a method, but it endures because it works. And in the world of warfare, that's the only test that truly matters. Offset bombing didn't just change how targets were hit. It changed how missions were planned, how air crews were trained, and how entire wars were fought. It made precision possible in a world where precision once seemed like a myth. But perhaps its most lasting contribution is how it bridged the gap between human judgment and machine capability. Long before computers could guide a bomb to its target, it was people, navigators, bombardiers, and pilots, doing calculations, making the calls, and trusting each other under extreme pressure. Offset bombing was never about perfection. It was about trust. Trust in training, trust in math, and trust in your crew. That culture of teamwork still defines modern air operations. Whether the stealth bomber flying with a two-person crew or a team of drone operators managing long-range strikes from halfway across the world, the spirit is the same. Clear thinking under pressure, fast, informed decisions, and the understanding that even the most advanced technology still depends on the people behind it. There's also a deeper, more human legacy. Offset bombing is a story about adaptability, about how real innovation often comes from the people closest to the problem, not from generals or engineers, but for men in the field making choices with limited time, imperfect data, and everything on the line. It's easy to look back at history and assume progress moved in a straight line, that the Allies always had the upper hand. That victory was inevitable. But the reality, as this story shows, is much messier. The early days of strategic bombing were filled with failure. Missions missed. Crews died. Results didn't match promises. And morale was at a breaking point. Offset bombing didn't arrive as part of some grand plan. It emerged in the middle of chaos. From a single mission, a single error, a single course correction, and it ended up saving lives, transforming doctrine, and influencing generations of strategy. That's what makes it timeless. Because in today's world, where militaries face rapid change, shifting threats, and the constant challenge of contested environments, the need for fast, smart adaptation has never been greater. You can have all the tools in the world, but if you don't know how to pivot when they stop working, you're finished. Offset bombing reminds us that resilience isn't about always having the best gear. It's about knowing how to think clearly when things fall apart. It's about mastering fundamentals so thoroughly that when everything else is stripped away, when GPS is jammed, when systems fail, when visibility is zero, you still have a shot at hitting the mark. It's also about humility, the willingness to admit that your current method isn't working, the discipline to relearn something new, even if you've already been through hell, and the wisdom to realize that sometimes aiming at the wrong place is what finally gets you the right one. The men who pioneered offset bombing didn't seek credit. They were just doing their jobs. But their actions left behind a blueprint for how to adapt under fire, how to turn an idea into a method, and a method into a doctrine. Their legacy isn't just written in military manuals. It's etched into the way modern forces train, fight, and think. It's there every time a crew adjusts mid-mission, every time a system fails and someone pulls out the math, every time a bomb hits its target. Not because of luck or tech, but because someone understood the wind, the angle, and the mission. Offset bombing is more than history. It's a mindset, one built not in a lab, but in the sky, under fire, against the odds. And as long as planes fly into danger, that mindset will keep flying with them,